The coffee at Murphy's Diner had been burnt for 30 years, and 81-year-old Frank Kowalski wouldn't have it any other way. Every Tuesday morning at exactly 7:30, the Vietnam War veteran shuffled through the familiar doors, his cane tapping a steady rhythm against the worn linoleum, heading for the same corner booth where he'd been sitting since his wife Eleanor passed 5 years ago. The waitresses knew his order by heart: black coffee, wheat toast, and scrambled eggs, and the other regulars had long ago stopped trying to make conversation with the quiet old man, who always sat alone. Frank's weathered hands bore the scars of jungle warfare and decades of factory work, and his Purple Heart medal hung proudly from his keychain, though he rarely spoke of the battles that had earned it. His Social Security check barely covered rent and groceries, but he never complained, finding solace in the simple routine of his weekly breakfast and the newspaper he read cover to cover while nursing his coffee for exactly 1 hour. This Tuesday started like all the others, with Frank settling into his booth and unfolding the local paper with careful precision. He was reading about the high school football team's championship hopes when the diner's peaceful morning atmosphere shattered like glass. "You're in my seat, old man," growled a voice that made every conversation in the diner stop mid-sentence. Frank looked up to see Derek Mason looming over his table, 6 feet of muscle, tattoos, and barely controlled aggression. At 25, Derek had spent more time in county lockup than most people spend in college, and his reputation for violence preceded him wherever he went in their small Michigan town. Behind him stood 2 equally menacing friends, their presence turning the cozy diner into something that felt suddenly dangerous. "I'm sorry," Frank said quietly, his voice carrying the measured calm of someone who'd faced far worse threats in Vietnamese rice paddies. "I think there's been a mistake." "I've been sitting here for years." Derek's laugh was harsh and humorless. "Well, things change, Gramps. Me and my boys decided we liked this spot. Time for you to move along." The diner fell completely silent except for the nervous clatter of a fork being set down too quickly. Marge, the 60-something waitress who'd been serving Frank for decades, moved closer with protective instincts, but the fear in her eyes was obvious. The other customers suddenly found their breakfast plates fascinating, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. "I'll just finish my coffee and be on my way," Frank said evenly, reaching for his cup with hands that showed no tremor despite his age. That's when Derek made the mistake that would change everything. With casual cruelty that spoke of a man who enjoyed intimidating those weaker than himself, he backhanded Frank across the face with enough force to knock the old veteran's glasses sideways and split his bottom lip. "I said move, now." The sound of the slap echoed through the diner like a gunshot. Frank's head snapped to the side, but he didn't cry out, didn't beg, didn't even put his hand to his bleeding lip. He simply straightened his glasses with the dignity of someone who had endured far greater indignities in service to his country, and began slowly gathering his newspaper. That's when the rumble started. At first, it sounded like distant thunder, but as it grew closer, everyone in the diner recognized the distinctive growl of motorcycle engines, not 1 or 2, but many, approaching fast. Derek and his friends exchanged uncertain glances as the sound grew louder, closer, until it seemed to surround the building entirely. The diner door exploded open with a force that rattled the windows, and Michael Kowalski strode in with the controlled fury of a man who'd inherited his father's military bearing along with his sense of justice. At 45, Mike was a successful contractor who'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan, but today he looked like the avenging angel his father had never known he needed. Behind him came 12 of the biggest, most intimidating men anyone in that diner had ever seen. They weren't the stereotypical outlaw bikers from movies. These were members of the Patriot Guard Riders, a motorcycle group dedicated to honoring military veterans. Some were active-duty military, others were police officers and firefighters. All were men who understood the sacred nature of respect owed to those who'd served. "Dad?" Mike's voice carried across the suddenly electric silence as he took in the scene. His father's split lip, the overturned coffee cup, Derek standing over the booth with his fists still clenched. Frank looked up at his son with surprise and something that might have been relief. "Michael, what are you doing here?" "Tommy Jenkins called me. Mike said, never taking his eyes off Derek. Tommy was the short-order cook who'd served with Mike's unit in Afghanistan and had been working the breakfast shift when Derek arrived. Said someone was bothering my old man. Derek, who had seemed so intimidating moments before, now looked like what he truly was, a small-town bully facing the consequences of his actions. The 12 bikers behind Mike weren't making threats or posturing. They simply stood there in their leather jackets decorated with military patches and POW MIA pins, their presence speaking louder than any words. "Look, this is just a misunderstanding," Derek stammered, suddenly finding his voice several octaves higher. "We were just talking." "Talking?" Mike stepped closer, and Derek actually took a step back. "Is that what you call putting your hands on an 81-year-old Purple Heart recipient?" One of the bikers, a mountain of a man with sergeant's stripes tattooed on his forearm, spoke up. "Brother fought in 3 tours in Nam, lost his best friend saving his unit. You think that gives you the right to disrespect him in his own neighborhood diner?" Derek's friends had already begun edging toward the back exit, their loyalty evaporating faster than steam from coffee. Derek himself looked like he wanted nothing more than to disappear entirely. "I didn't know," Derek muttered, which was perhaps the first honest thing he'd said all morning. "That's the problem," Mike said, his voice carrying the weight of generations of military service. "You didn't know because you never bothered to learn. This man served his country with honor while you've been serving time for petty theft and assault." Frank slowly stood up, his cane steady in his hand, and for a moment everyone in the diner saw him not as a frail old man, but as the decorated soldier he'd once been. "Son," he said to Mike, "I appreciate you coming, but this doesn't need to escalate further." Mike looked at his father, seeing the dignity that no bully could ever strip away, and nodded. "You're right, Dad, as always." He turned back to Derek, who was now visibly sweating despite the morning chill. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to apologize to my father. Then you're going to pay for everyone's breakfast in this diner. And then you're going to walk out of here and never bother another veteran as long as you live. And if we see you disrespecting any senior citizen, anywhere, ever again," added the sergeant with the tattoos, "we'll be having a different kind of conversation." Derek's apology was stammered and pathetic, but Frank accepted it with the grace he'd shown throughout the entire encounter. After Derek and his friends slunk out of the diner like whipped dogs, the bikers filed out more slowly, each stopping to shake Frank's hand and thank him for his service. Mike was the last to leave, helping his father back into the booth and signaling Marge for fresh coffee and a clean napkin for Frank's lip. "How did you know to come?" Frank asked, still processing what had just happened. "Tommy's not the only one looking out for you. Dad. Half this town knows you eat here every Tuesday. Mrs. Patterson from the flower shop, Joe from the hardware store, even some of the high school kids you helped with their history projects. You've got more people caring about you than you realize." Frank sat quietly for a moment, absorbing this revelation. "I never knew." "That's because you never make a fuss about the good you do. But people remember, Dad. They remember when you helped the Martinez family move in despite barely knowing them. They remember when you anonymously paid for the Williams kids' school supplies. They remember because that's what real heroes do. They serve without expecting recognition." As the diner slowly returned to its normal rhythm, Frank picked up his newspaper with hands that were steadier than they'd been in years. For the first time since Eleanor's passing, he didn't feel alone in his corner booth. He felt surrounded by a community that valued the same things he'd always believed in: respect, service, and the understanding that true strength comes from protecting those who need protection. Sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought on foreign soil, but in the everyday moments when good people choose to stand up for what's right. And sometimes the cavalry arrives on motorcycles, carrying the same values that built the country worth defending.